Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we are now live on Facebook, and our session is being recorded now, inshallah ta'ala. I am Alpha Senon, your moderator for this evening session, and I will now want to pass you on to Akinola, who will let's bring us some opening remarks, inshallah ta'ala. Over to you.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dearly beloved family, friends, associates. Welcome one and all to our Friday evening platform called Who Am I? I think we as an organization, that is IFL, that is the Institute for Life, saw it absolutely necessary for the implementation of a program as such. Why have we seen it absolutely necessary? Because I think the experiences that we have experienced as a people historically and otherwise that brought us to the point that where we are right now, a lot of us, from a systematic standpoint, is not able to confidently, refer or relate or to answer that question of who are you? That question of who am I? And I think, not being able to answer that question, it places one in a bad state individually and also collectively as a community of people. We are the results in many instances of socially engineered initiatives. We are the results in many instances of slavery, colonialism, and other ill things that has occurred throughout the passage of time. And, it brought us to that place of, not being able to know fully who are you? And, not being able to know thyself, and your history and your present condition, you definitely wouldn't be in a place to know where you're going. And dearly beloved family, this places us in a terrible situation that would even become more terrible for that of our future generations. So this program is geared towards not only understanding who we are, but presenting a way forward that can chart that course to take off us the present course that we presently exist in, so that, our children, when we pass that baton of them to them, would be able to taste that taste of freedom in this life and in the next life, inshallah. So who am I? Alhamdulillah, thanks for taking the time out from your Friday evening schedule to log on to this program, to be a part of our gathering, although it's online for now, and to be a part of this sharing and this unified effort as we move forward together, discovering who we are, where we are, and where we are going. Assalamu alaikum. Back over to you, Brother Alpha.
MashaAllah, wonderful greetings, great reminders, and really a lot of food for thought, or thought for food, to really stimulate the mind, to have the real meat of the matter moving forward for the night's proceeding. So at this point in time, I want to introduce our beloved brother, our beloved professor, none other than Dr. Rudolph Bilal Ware. who is a professor of history at the University of Michigan, specializes in pre-modern West African history. His research interests include Islam, popular religious culture, and race. His book, The Walking Qur'an Islamic Education, Embodied Knowledge and History in West Africa, interrogates the role of Islamic education in shaping Muslim identities and examines the way in which Quranic schools has articulated with Sufi orders, Muslim reformers, and the state in the recent past. So it's an absolute pleasure and an absolute honor to have such lights in our presence at the moment. Dr. Rudolph Bilal Ware, who is joining us. I'm not sure which part of the world he is right now, but he's always traveling the globe and doing this good work, and may Allah reward him. So at this time, for taking time off, and maybe he might be in a different time zone as well, I'm not sure. But inshallah, we welcome you to unmute your mics and make this evening's key feature address. Welcome, Dr. Bilal Ware.
I found it. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
I'm gonna try to get a little better lighting. So I'm actually logging in from Los Angeles. You asked where in the world I am. I'm traveling down from University of California, Santa Barbara, and giving a lecture this weekend called Islam and Black Culture from Kemet to Crenshaw. So in town in preparation for that. And pardon me logging in on my daughter's iPad because my computer wouldn't turn on. So I'm lacking the slides that I had planned to use for today's presentation, but this is material that I know very well, and I'm going to tell a story that will hopefully add a different dimension to the way that we answer the question, who am I? And I want to thank our brother Akinola for both setting the stage and kind of preparing our hearts for this evening's conversation. So I'm just gonna. I think that in the interest of time, and also in providing the most benefit with the time that we have, I'm going to tell a single story. This particular story can be found, or at least portions of it can be found, in my book that our brother just mentioned, The Walking Qur'an Islamic Education, Embodied Knowledge and History in West Africa. In the third chapter, although some of the material that I'm going to present to you this evening, as it were, is material that did not appear in that form. It's ongoing research that I've given into the subject matter. And our brother talked about understanding where we actually come from as the way of lighting the way forward. The way forward as we struggle against regimes of corporate capitalism and state structures which seek to turn our bodies and our very beings into commodities. Whether it is through the carceral state in North America, whether it is through the way labor regimes and tourism construct and objectify Black bodies in the Caribbean and elsewhere, we are constantly in this day and age being transformed into objects for the consumption of others. As Muslims of African descent, indeed as believing people of African descent, it is our moral, ethical, and spiritual obligation to struggle against anything that would dehumanize any of the children of Adam. And it is certainly our responsibility as African descended people to struggle against the dehumanization of Black people specifically. So where do we turn in our past for stories of inspiration? We can certainly turn to the more recent past. Figures such as Alhaj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X, and stories that are well known. But I'm going to try to tell a story that is a little less well known, perhaps to some of you. And if you happen to be in position to put your camera on just so that I can talk to a full room, I would love the opportunity to see y'all's beautiful faces as we work our way through the material. Because I don't know about y'all, but I was raised in an African-American rhetorical tradition that is built on call and response. I expect to see people nodding or saying, so I'm used to getting that feedback, and I understand everybody can't always do that when we're on Zoom, but I appreciate y'all making the effort. So the story that I'm going to tell is a story that many of you are unlikely to have heard. It is the story of the first republic in the modern world to abolish the institution of slavery, to take a stand against the commoditization of Black bodies at the height of the Atlantic slave trade. And when I say we're going to talk about the first republic to abolish the institution of slavery, where's the first place that y'all's mind's going to go? Use the raise hand button if you like. What's the first thing that you're going to think of, or perhaps even put it in the chat? Haiti, exactly. Everybody's going to go to Haiti, long forgotten as part of the long forgotten as part of the age of revolutions, right? As the story of the American Revolution and the French Revolution were glorified as bringing liberty to humanity, while they nonetheless compromised on the institution of slavery. We know, of course, that Haitian rebels from the year 1791 through 1804 defeated not just the French, but also the Spanish and the English, the largest imperial states on the face of the earth at that point in time, to gain full liberation and become the first republic in the Western Hemisphere to fully abolish the institution of slavery. Striking a blow to corporate capitalism and to human bondage. What many of us don't know is that in the Senegal River Valley in the 1770s, an Islamic republic had already made this same move. And indeed, in point of fact, some of the rebels that were part of resisting the rise of the Atlantic slave trade in the Senegal River Valley were people that ended up themselves being reduced to bondage and servitude, sold into slavery in the New World, and participating in slave rebellions in Antigua, in Trinidad, in Bahia in Brazil, and yes, indeed, in the Haitian Revolution itself. So I want to take us back to some African genealogies and African Islamic genealogies of resistance to the commoditization of Black bodies. And I'm just going to tell the story about that revolution now. In 1770, a Muslim cleric, jet Black Muslim scholar by the name of Suleiman Baal began preaching against the iniquities of the kings in the Senegal River Valley in the region known as Fouta Toro. In the 1770s, as had been the case for almost 200 years in that part of West Africa, African kings who were in the employ of European slave dealers, oftentimes armed and furnished with weapons and munitions and financial resources by European slavers, had been serving as the way that one historian of the time, writing in the 1790s, described it, had been serving as wolves instead of shepherds amongst their people. These were African kings who were selling other Africans into bondage in the employ of Europeans. So Suleiman Baal in the year 1770 begins preaching against this, and ultimately foments a resistance movement that is going to end up toppling the most powerful slave trading states in the Senegal region in the year 1776, a good year, some would say, for revolutions, with the American Declaration of Independence in mind. However, when the Americans declared their independence in 1776 and ultimately cast their constitution in 1787, they decided that enslaved and bonded Africans in the southern colonies would be counted for purposes of congressional representation as 3/5 of a person, but would of course have no rights. They compromised, the 3/5 compromise, as it's usually referenced, on the institution of slavery. This resistance movement in the Senegal River Valley made the opposite move. Suleiman Baal, the preacher who began this resistance movement and began a military struggle to depose these slave trading kings in the Senegal River Valley, was ultimately slain in a field of battle in 1775. And he was replaced at the head of this movement by a person called Abdul Qadir Khan, also known as Al-Mami or Al-Imam, the Imam Abdul Qadir Khan. And I'd like to just give you my quote from memory, since I don't have my slides, of the Reverend Thomas Clarkson's description of Abdul Qadir Khan. Now, who is the Reverend Thomas Clarkson? Those of you who are students of African resistance and of abolition will know that the Reverend Thomas Clarkson is the founder of the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, an institution that is founded in the 1790s, the first modern English abolitionist institution. The Reverend Thomas Clarkson was the person who taught William Wilberforce about abolition. Wilberforce gets all the credit, and he is the name that's usually referenced with respect to the end of the slave trade. However, the Reverend Thomas Clarkson was the founder of that movement. Wilberforce followed behind him. People also don't know that the Reverend Thomas Clarkson was also the founder of La Société des Amis des Noirs, the Society of the Friends of Blacks, which was the first modern French abolitionist institution. But would you like to know who the Reverend Thomas Clarkson claimed as his greatest inspiration in the struggle for human liberty? He pointed to Abdul Qadir Khan, an African Muslim cleric, in Clarkson's first publication on the illegality of the slave trade, a book called Letters on the Slave Trade that he published first in French in 1789, and then later again in English in 1791. And in it, he says of Abdul Qadir Khan, an African Muslim ruler who ends up abolishing the slave trade in the Senegal River Valley in 1776 and establishing an independent republic, no monarchy, and a free republic, no slaves, in 1776. Of Abdul Qadir Khan, he says in Letters on the Slave Trade, he says, the wise and virtuous Imam sets an illustrious example in extirpating the commerce in the human race. And when we think that of this amiable man as having been trained and raised up in a land of slavery, and as having had in the introduction of his revolution, all of the precedent and custom to oppose him, as we consider him as having refused the presence of the Europeans and having subjected himself to the vindictive ravages of their agents through his abolition, he is certainly more to be praised than any of the sovereigns of Europe, as he has done more for the causes of humanity, liberty, justice, and religion. End of quote. The founder of the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade in 1789 and 1791 credits an African Muslim, and we might point out that this is the year that the Haitian Revolution is beginning, credits an African Muslim as doing more for the causes of humanity, liberty, and justice and religion than any of the sovereigns of Europe of that time. Before the abolition of the international slave trade by Britain in 1807, before the abolition of the international slave trade by the United States of America in that same year. Clarkson, who was founding the modern European abolitionist movement, pointed to the lived example of African Muslims as the archetype of that which he sought to instantiate in the West. So I ask you, is this the story that you have heard about abolition? Or were you told, as was I through my educational process, that Western abolitionism emerged out of Christian do-gooderism? That the same people that had authored the Atlantic slave trade found Jesus and decided that it wasn't good anymore for them to trade in African bodies. And therefore, for ethical reasons, or if you follow our beloved teacher and mentor, Eric Williams, in his classic magnum opus, Capitalism and Slavery, for economic reasons, but one way or the other, the impetus for the ending of the Atlantic slave trade comes from Europeans, whether through fiscal motives or through intellectual and moral ones. Whereas the research that I've been able to undertake actually shows that it was widely known at the end of the 18th century, before the rise of the Haitian Revolution, that it was African Muslims who actually pioneered the effort to end the slave trade itself, and to end the institution of slavery within all of the dominions that were controlled by Abdul Qadir Khan. And this wasn't something that just Thomas Clarkson was aware of. Clarkson himself had interviewed slave ship captains who had been traveling back and forth from Senegal to France during the time that he was resident in France. He had interviewed a French botanist, René Geoffroy de Villeneuve, who spoke fluent Wolof and had lived on the mainland for 3.5 years, and he detailed him every single piece of the story of this revolution. Clarkson devoted over a quarter of his first work, Letters on the Slave Trade, to detailing this African Muslim resistance to the rise of the commoditization of Black bodies in the modern era, predating the Haitian Revolution, predating the debates about liberty in the French and American revolutions. So then what happened to this story? If this was a story that was well known in its time, how come it disappeared? I'm going to come back to that question in a moment, but the beginning of the answer is that for generations, indeed centuries, radical Black scholars have taught us that the most powerful form of social control that the colonizers have ever been able to exercise against us is to rob us of our past, rob us of our memory, rob us of our history. Because a people that don't know where they're from can't know where they're going. A people that don't know what they're capable of are incapable of dreaming of futures that are unlike the oppressive presence that they reside in. This is a past that was silenced, because I can tell you, when you dig into the sources at the end of the 18th century, everyone was talking about it. Pro-slavery voices, anti-slavery voices. This revolution was turning up in newspapers. You don't just have an entire region of West Africa that was the predominant source of slave supply withdraw from the Atlantic slave trade, and it passed without mention. The last British governor of Senegal, before it goes over to becoming a French colony in perpetuity after 1811, is a person named, his last name is Maxwell. In his final report, closing out the dossier, so to speak, on the British occupation of Senegal in 1811, he offers the following reflections. He says, "It may be necessary here to remark that our negotiations with the Imam, the Almami of Futa Toro, this Abdul Qadir Khan that I mentioned before, have greatly improved since our abolition of the slave trade, a commerce which that prince always opposed as being contrary to the laws of his religion, and the means through which many of his co-religionists, followers of the Prophet, had been reduced to bondage." There were pro-slavery advocates that demonized Abdul Qadir Khan, and the word that they used to describe him was, they described the temerity and audacity of this African ruler who thought that he had it within his right to protect his people from enslavement by withdrawing the entirety of the Senegal River Valley from the Atlantic slave trade. Not only did he not participate in trading slaves with Europeans, but he forbade that any slaves be passed through his country to be traded with Europeans. And then, as Clarkson specifies again, Letters on the Slave Trade, not only did he forbid the trade of slaves and the passage of slaves, but he liberated any enslaved persons in his territory with the following mechanism. His proclamation was that anyone capable of reciting so much as a single ayah of the Quran was to be immediately freed. For Abdul Qadir Khan and for the revolutionaries of late 18th century Senegambia, not a single verse of the book of God could be held in chains. Not a single letter of the Quran, because indeed, there are certain surahs of the Quran, as we well know, that are comprised of a single Arabic letter, a single ayahs rather. So if all that's required is the recitation of a single ayah in order to liberate yourself, Qaf is an ayah. Abdul Qadir Khan, the oral tradition reports, said that the Muslim that should be protected from the indignities of slavery is the one that says La ilaha illallah, even if he pronounces it Ra iraha irara. For Khan, he wanted to use Islam's formal legal protection that prevented the enslavement of Muslims by Muslims as a blanket shield to protect any Black person willing to at least make the lip service testification of faith. He wished to make that a shield against their bondage. And there is indeed a long tradition amongst African Islamic scholars from Timbuktu in the 15th century and 16th century through people like Abdul Qadir Khan in the 18th, right down to people like the famous 19th and 20th century Senegalese Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, of taking a principled moral stance against the institution of slavery. And I'll go back to Khan's story, but a story to Bamba is flashing across my eyes, so I'll have to tell it. They said that at the sometime in the late 19th century, when the colonization of Senegal by the permanent colonization of Senegal by the French had not yet been completely filled, and there was still a practice of domestic slavery in the region. But someone came to this great accomplished scholar, Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, author of at least 200 distinct books in the Arabic language, some of them as collections as many as 200 poems, some of those poems containing as many as 5,000 lines. And as an act of devotion, they attempted to offer to Sheikh Bamba the gift of an enslaved person. And Bamba said to them, he said, "You own this man?" And the man said, "Yes." He said, "I'm giving him to you." He said in Wolof, he said, "Soko mom me yama mom, dachmag mom nyo boko borom," which means, if you own him, then you own me, because he and I have the same master. The only master that Bamba was willing to accept is God. And this was indeed a thread that ran through African Islamic thought, with precedents going back to Timbuktu in the 16th century. This was what was animating and motivating those West African scholars. The idea that that the fundamental the fundamental principle with respect to humanity is their liberty. And only a limited number of circumstances ever, under any circumstances, allowed people to have their liberty removed. And those circumstances did not obtain in the 16th century, 17th century, or 18th century. They wanted this institution gone from the African map and didn't consider it as being sanctioned by Islam. And scholars in this vein, including a late 19th, early 20th century scholar, also from the Senegal River Valley, called Sheikh Musa Kamara. Kamara wrote about the ending of slavery as being the fulfillment of the last wish of the Prophet Muhammad himself, peace be upon him, who, he points out, freed anyone that he had ever owned before he died, and that if the Muslims were serious about following the Sunnah, then the institution would have died out within a generation after him. Sheikh Musa Kamara also points out that, and these were very famous narrations, that the Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, in the wars with the Persians, if he found Persian captives praying in the ranks of the captives, he would liberate them immediately. They came to him and they said, "Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, O leader of the faithful, don't you know that they're just deceiving you? They're pretending to pray so that you'll let them free." And Omar said, "Better to be deceived by one who deceives us in favor of God than to keep in bondage one who prays to him." This was the character of Umar ibn al-Khattab. This was the example that, as he understood it, of the Sunnah, and this was the thread of Islamic thought that Black Muslim scholars were enacting in the 1770s when they undertook this effort to end the Atlantic slave trade and stop the reduction of human beings to bondage in all of the areas that they could control. Many, many stories could be told about that struggle. For a 30-year period from 1776 until 1806, the Senegal River Valley serves as a beacon of freedom throughout West Africa, and waves of freedom seekers radiate out from there. One of the things that people don't understand is that indeed the famous revolutionary movement of Sheikh Uthman Dan Fodio in northern Nigeria that begins about a generation after the movement of Khan is inspired in part by Khan's revolution. It's both in Fula-speaking regions, and also Usman Dan Fodio's principal objection to the rule of the so-called Muslim leaders of the House of State in that time was that they were trading believing people for bottles of rum and for firearms with Europeans. And that was the fundamental motive that led to the rise of what ultimately becomes called the Sokoto Caliphate in northern Nigeria. There's an episode of Africa's Great Civilizations with Professor Henry Louis Gates where I talk about this in great detail. So I can't go into every last story about the waves of this Islamic anti-slavery in Africa. But I want to go back to the way that Akinola set the table for us, which is about who we are. And I'm going to tell one story that is about the way in which these revolutionary movements are a part of who we become in the diaspora. So in 1796, Abdul Qadir Khan suffers the only significant military defeat of his career until he's ultimately assassinated in 1806, and the slave trade is reinstituted in the region, which is sort of the sad end to this to that particular story. But he suffers one defeat in 1796. In that defeat in 1796, he is taken captive, and many of his lieutenants are sold into bondage. There's a Scottish explorer who happens to be resident in Senegambia region, Mungo Park. He's known for leaving a number of accounts of West Africa in that time period. You may or may not have heard of him. But Mungo Park points out, he says that he heard stories about Abdul Qadir Khan being captured because this was a very famous story. This was the most famous, military and spiritual leader of the time. And he was taken prisoner by a slave trading king in 1796. And many of his lieutenants were sent into bondage. Khan himself was ultimately liberated and released. And you can ask me about that in the Q&A, but I'll finish the story in the interest of time. Mungo Park points out that he had this story of what happened between Abdul Qadir Khan and the Damal of Kajor, that particular slave trading king, confirmed because as he was leaving Senegal to go to Charleston, as it was, South Carolina, on a ship that was called fortuitously the Charleston, he said that I went on a ship that had 120 slaves on it, the Charleston. He said 25 of them were literate scholars and I conversed with them in Arabic. So I just want to underline that point before we continue. 120 people in bondage on this vessel. He said 25 of them were literate scholars and I conversed with them in Arabic. He said then, he said 9 of them were lieutenants of Abdul Qadir Khan, and they confirmed for me the story that I had heard about the famous battle. He said the ship sprang a leak. And the enslaved had to be brought above board to bail water out of the boat, and it couldn't make it to Charleston. It had to come aboard dry land at Antigua instead because it was the closest point, and all of the enslaved were sold at that point in time in order to pay the cost of the vessel, which had essentially been totaled. Okay, so it occurred to me After doing a study of the slavevoyages.org database maintained at Emory University and realizing that there had not been any direct imports from predominantly Muslim regions into Antigua for about 25 years before this boat happens to come ashore in 1796, it occurred to me that these brothers are going to stick out like a sore thumb in Antigua. Let me see if I can look at something in the records. So I find a newspaper for Antigua that has numbers that start to run in 1786, and I go right to 1796, and 6 months after the boat touches ground in Antigua, there's a slave rebellion.
Takbir.
Fomented, it is said in the newspapers, only by a slave that is known only by the name, a mysterious slave known only by the name Gorée. Gorée being the name of the port of embarkment of slaves. In Senegal, you can still go and see the castle from which Gorée was embarked, most likely. The point is that these brothers exported their revolution. I have been able to track revolutionaries from the Senegambia region to rebellions in Senegal, in Jamaica, in Trinidad, in South Carolina, runaways, including 2 enslaved women that became prominent figures in this period. Because the revolution was not just being discussed in drawing rooms amongst white abolitionists in London and Paris, it was also being exported through the slave barracks. I've been able to uncover a story of a particular individual who is taken captive that day with Abdul Qadir Khan in 1796, sold into bondage, ends up in Saint-Domingue and ends up fighting alongside Toussaint Louverture a few years after he was sold into slavery, fighting alongside Abdul Qadir Khan. We are a revolutionary people. We have resisted the rise of these structures that are designed to commoditize and dehumanize us since their initiation. Since they began, we have resisted them. And we have drawn on the moral and ethical resources of our religion in order to frame that resistance. The contemporary manifestations of those devilish, pernicious institutions are now white supremacist political regimes and corporate capitalism, which seek to commoditize every aspect of human life the same way in which they once commoditized our bodies. And if we do not situate ourselves in the footsteps of our African abolitionist ancestors by drawing on the moral resources of our religious tradition to stand against the fundamental injustices of time, then how will history tell our story? Better still, what will we say when questioned by the Lord of the throne? When you saw this injustice, did you stop it with your hand the way that my messenger asked you to? Did you speak against it with your tongue the way that he commanded? Did you even turn your heart against it? Or did you simply go along to get along? The religion of Islam, especially as embodied by our ancestors, is a religion of spirituality and social justice that are paired. It is not personal piety alone. Rather, it is the struggle to be renewed spiritually so that one can go out and become an agent for justice in the world, struggling against the fundamental injustices of the time. And indeed, any intelligent reading of the Quran shows that all of the messengers, peace be upon them all, were at the forefront of the struggle against the fundamental injustices of their time. And do you know why? Because they ain't the people of God unless they are struggling against the foremost injustices of their time. This is the basic legacy that our African Muslim ancestors have bequeathed to us if we would only embrace it. So in the interest of time, I will stop here and take questions on tonight's presentation.
MashaAllah, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. I don't know. I don't know if everyone else seats is burning up right now, but you speak the truth there, brother. You speak the truth, and we feel you. You know, I see some hands being raised. And first hand I'm seeing raised is our beloved Sheikh Hassan. Please go ahead, Maulana Hassan.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikhuna.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. You can, Ustaduna at best. You know,
Process Saida, alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah.
Sheikh, I've been following your lectures as much as they come on the internet. One question I have is sort of related to this issue. You were sitting with a British historian, and he was asking you about slavery in Islam, and you said
Christopher Brown from Columbia University. Good brother. Yes,
that's
absolutely.
the guy.
Yep.
Yeah, and he said that, you were working on a piece on slavery. Have you finished this?
So there's two. There's yes, the one of the pieces that's referenced there. So I have so in that talk I referenced the book, which is not finished. I just lectured from it. It's called The First Atlantic Revolution: Islam, Abolition, and Republic. But the other one is from the Cambridge World History of Slavery, Volume 4. So in that particular talk, I referenced a piece for Cambridge World History of Slavery, Volume 3, that had appeared at the time of the lecture. Since then, the piece for Cambridge World History of Slavery, Volume 4 has been published, and I would be happy to share it with the group in PDF form so that you can read it at your leisure, because it actually does encapsulate much of the connectedness of different African Muslim anti-slavery movements that emerged at the end of the 18th century and throughout the 19th century.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for your presence. And I hope this will not be the first and the last.
No, look, we already been talking about this. Sooner than later, I'm gonna come down and see y'all.
Yes, we want you. We want you. So
inshallah.
Thank you very much. And I'll leave the rest of questions to the other brothers, inshallah.
Okay, barakallah. Thank you, Sheikh. Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
MashaAllah. So then I see Brother Muhammad Akbar. Please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. Sheikh,
Alaikum salam.
How are
Yes,
you?
Sir. Alhamdulillah. I'm chilling, man. How are you?
Alhamdulillah. 4 righteous teachers in the house.
I mean. May God count us amongst those that teach with righteousness.
Amen. So we do the social justice work, but how much could you repair a broken system?
Whew.
Are we just working to collect these deeds for Qiyamah? But how much could we repair a rotten dead horse?
You've asked a real question. If you want my answer to the question, listen, fundamentally, it is impossible to, what's the word I'm looking for? Rectify that which is corrupt within white supremacist capitalism. It cannot be fixed. It's broken. What can happen is that we can begin to offer and create alternatives to this dominant order that can ultimately serve to structure a new one. And the reason why I'm confident about this is from a careful reading of 1, the Quranic text, and 2, history. So in Surah Hud, God explains to us the function of history itself. In the 120th ayah of the Quran's 11th chapter, God says, all that I relate to you in the tales from the previous prophets, with it I fortify your heart. Okay. Now, what is the fortification of the heart? Remember, the Quran never uses aql to refer to the mind. There's no reference to the mind in the Quran. The Quran uses aqla, intellection or understanding, as a verb, but the thing that does the understanding is the heart. So the heart is both the seat of emotion and understanding. It's the seat of motivation and courage and knowledge and inspiration. right? So the function of history is to teach us lessons and inspire us. Now, why this story that I told today in response to the call? Because ultimately, it was impossible, right? In the 1770s, at the height of the Atlantic slave trade, to abolish the Atlantic slave trade. And yet, Abdul Qadir Khan did it anyway. It was impossible to create non-monarchical forms of government, right? Because the divine right of kings was understood as a construct across cultures throughout humanity as the basic organizing mechanism of most states. So it seemed inevitable and impossible to offer the opposite until it wasn't, right? Until Haitian revolutionaries, without theorizing it, only drawing on African examples, created an independent republic without slavery, until circumstances pushed Khan. And actually the way that it happened is that the first thing that he did was, when he came to power in 1775, he offered freedom to the slaves of his enemies. The same way that Lincoln would later do, right? The same way that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had done at the siege of Taif. The point is that when you believe that an alternative world is possible, then you behave as though an alternative world is possible and you create one. And if you don't think it's possible, then tell me how Sayyidina Musa, alayhi afdal salatu wasalam, one black man, don't forget that Moses was black. The Prophet ﷺ said that he was asmar shadidul asmara or adam shadidul udma, deep black or deep brown in color, and his hair was jad, kinky and curly. He said in a separate narration that Moses was the most handsome of the black men. That's what he said about Moses. So don't forget that when Moses and Aaron went, it was two black men going to topple the most powerful tyranny on the face of the earth. That's impossible, except it happened. So for me, we simply have to draw on the spiritual, material, and economic resources that are present in our community. Listen, if we as Muslims, let's just take my country of the United States of America. If the Muslims were to do an 11-day buying boycott where we didn't buy anything and circulate any money into the economy, it would already cause the economy to seize. If we were joined in that in the next 11 days by all the Black people, the economy would definitely freeze. If we were joined in the third 11 days after that by Latin populations and indigenous populations, then the United States economy itself would come to a halt in less than a month. We have the power. It's just that our imaginations do not allow us to conceive alternatives to the order within which we have been raised. And I'll just give you the answer. I was sitting with the great contemporary Senegalese scholar, he's Canadian based now, Imam Fore Drame. And he was asked this very question. He said, how do we make a change? How do we get to the promised land? And he said people would be astonished how short the distance actually is. He said, ultimately, it is rooted in a change of perception. The problem with these regimes is that they portray themselves as impenetrable, but show me where their money is. I'll tell you what, they say Jeff Bezos has however many 100 million. Show me where his money is. As far as I understand, his money is a bunch of digits inside a computer. I don't think that he has any money. Show me where all of these are constructs. And they are all controlled by perception and imagination. Those of us that get our inspiration from the unseen and bring it into this world understand that this perishable, fleeting world will ultimately kneel before whatever comes from the unseen.
MashaAllah. So I'll move on to the chat and take someone's contribution, then question. We were taught that the Moors contributed to the transatlantic slave trade. I'm now learning that is false. And then the question is, can you give me an insight on the Africans who contributed to the transatlantic slave trade? Question mark.
Okay. Yes. So So the first thing that I'll say is that there were Moors that contributed to the transatlantic slave trade. One of the things that very plainly happens, and I document this in the 3rd chapter of the Walking Qur'an, is that the British in 1775, when Abdul Qadir Khan is coming to power and they are fearful of him, they arm the Arab and Berber inhabitants of the desert to go enslave Africans. So, and this is also one of the things that I wrote about in Cambridge World History of Slavery, Volume 3, is that the construction of the so-called Arab slave trade or the Islamic slave trade as something that is part of of Eastern history and part of somehow the religious history of Islam, that's a false construct. The majority of the enslaved in Arab lands and in Muslim lands before the rise of the Atlantic slave trade were not Black people. Black people come to be a significant part of the people that are held in bondage in Arab and Muslim societies because of the rise of the Atlantic slave trade. And indeed, in many respects, the Indian Ocean slave trade, as we know it in modern history, is an offshoot of the Atlantic slave trade. And there's something similar to be said about the Saharan trade, because I can show you documents that have the British and the French arming Moors, quote unquote Moors, not Black Moors as we would understand them, but Mauritanian populations that see themselves as non-Black, that see themselves as Berber or Arab in origin, and being turned loose to lay waste to African populations, because they themselves are, by that point in time, operating with ideologies of racial superiority that do not come from within Islam, but rather have developed as a part of Arab ethnic chauvinism. So the first thing that I would say is just a gentle correction. In that broader sense, Moors in that meaning do contribute to the Atlantic slave trade. They're also actually victims of it. And that's another thing that's often forgotten, is that when the slave trade first begins, Europeans aren't picky about just including Black folks. So there's lots of Arabs and Berbers and others that are actually sold into bondage in the New World and at the outset of that period as well. The history is more complicated than is usually led to believe. Now, with respect to the fundamental question, how do Africans get pulled into the trade? Listen, I give an entire lecture about this. I usually give this as a guest lecture in my colleagues' world history classes. In my pre-colonial African history classes, this is the lecture that most people usually appreciate. It's hard to give the 30-second version, but here's the 30-second version.
Okay.
If you don't know else, people are often talking about African voluntary participation. But as soon as you start to study the participation of Africans in the slave trade, you realize that Africans are resisting and trying to withdraw from the beginning. The Afonso, the king of the Congo, from 1506 to 1537, writes letters to the king of Portugal in 1526 saying, "No more merchants, we want out." The Oba of Benin in 1506, when the slave trade is rising, they burn all of the forts, kill all the Europeans, and retreat back to the interior, not to have any subsequent trade with Europeans for 200 years, until neighboring communities have begun getting involved in the slave trade. And now, in order to acquire firearms to defend themselves against being preyed upon by neighboring populations, they have to trade slaves with Europeans just to get guns. And I'll just point this out. Between 1750 and 1800, there are between 350,000 and 400,000 guns per year being sold into West Africa. 3/4 of all the European value of the goods that were exchanged for slaves during the entirety of the Atlantic slave trade are in these 3 categories: guns and ammunition, alcohol, drugs and tobacco, cloth and clothing. That accounts for 75% of the European trade value of all the goods that were exchanged for people. The point is that once Europeans are unwilling to accept anything as currency for international trade, except for people, then everyone along the coast is damned as long as the Europeans are interested in people. Because if you can find one person that's willing to trade, that's willing to make themselves a king at their neighbor's expense, then eventually everyone will have to. Because to defend yourself against the predations of such kings, you're going to have to arm yourself with firearms like they have. And the only thing that you can trade in order to get firearms is people. So time and time again, Africans make the same calculation. They victimize other people's people in order to protect their own. And that is what is so striking and extraordinary about the story of Abdul Qadir Khan and those Senegambian revolutions, is that they ultimately decide that our people that we are going to protect are all people. Anyone that even says they're Muslim, we're counting as us. And one of the most interesting elements of this history is how they attempt to construct an economic model that gives them access to European trade goods without dealing people. One of the first things, and this is a really, really important point actually about corporate capitalism, and because it's slave traders that make this note, they said that the people from Abdul Qadir Khan's community always pay in cash. They never take loans. Because oftentimes what produced the obligation to enslave people was debt. Kings would, and Afonso talked about this in those first letters in the 1520s, is that people would take out loans in order to get European trade goods on the promise of delivery of commodities. And if they didn't deliver those slaves, then they became the commodities that were enslaved. So this leads to a vicious cycle. So one of the first things is stay out of debt. That's how capitalism controls you. That's how it gets you to literally sell yourself into bondage.
Jazakallah khair. So then I'll pass it over to Brother Donnell to unmute his mic and ask his question, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Jazakallah khairan, for the very enlightening presentation. My question is very short and simple. To what extent do you think it is important for Muslims of African descent in the diaspora to reconnect with West African scholarship? And I ask that question because here in Trinidad, in the main, largely speaking, we are exposed to scholars mainly from two streams, either from those trained in like Deobandi subcontinental institutions, or those trained in like Middle Eastern Salafi institutions, right?
Whew, that's a tough spot to be in.
Yeah, and we have been largely or almost exclusively like cut off from West African scholarship. I'm sure if you were to ask somebody in this group if they've ever interacted with a West African scholar, the answer in most cases might be no, right? So to what extent do you think that that is important in terms of us reestablishing our identity and, you know, forging the way forward?
Man, I mean, listen, I've bet my whole life and academic career on the idea that this is the key to salvation for our people. Because frankly, I don't know how we are going to find a way forward without a connection to our past as Muslims. I know that the 15-year-old version of me that converted to Islam couldn't find peace in communities of South Asian and Arab descent that looked on me with contempt because they are harboring their own anti-Blackness. I know that it changed my heart to realize that Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba had written more and better books than any of the scholars that they could put forward. That Uthman Dan Fodio had written more and better books than those scholars. That Sheikh Ibrahim Yas had brought 50 million people into Islam during his lifetime. That we had exemplars of our tradition. And I'll go further, is that we cannot decolonize our understandings of Islam when it's filtered through their perspectives. I'll give you a few simple examples. How many of us knew that Musa was Black? They don't tell us that. Now, do they? Because that's not a priority in the way that they present the religion. But here's the thing. The majority of the Qisas al-Anbiya, the majority of the tales of the prophets that occur in the Quran take place in the ancient Nile Valley or around the ancient Nile Valley. Well, what color were the ancient Egyptians? So the point is we're having this conversation as though we're not part of the sacred story, but we've been part of the sacred story from the time of the Quran itself through these great scholars. And part of how we remedy what has been done to us in the destruction of our self-esteem as African people is to simply find ourselves again in the story. And we can't expect other people to do that for us. And we can't expect that we will be able to heal from the racialization of the broader society that's oppressed us. Not to mention the way that some of our co-religionists of South Asian or Arab background treat us like second-class citizens in our own faith.
MashaAllah. All right, I'll pass it over to Akinola now.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh.
Wa alaikum salam rahmatullah.
One of my observations is that for the fostering or and the continuity of colonialism, it seems to me that culture was used as a tool, to continuously foster this colonialism upon our people. And I am asking, does culture play a role in this decolonialism process? And I kind of want to ask that because we are exposed to scholarships in Trinidad that and in the region at large that says that culture haram.
They're always trying to make Black culture haram. They don't stop listening to their music. They don't stop listening to their poets. They're always trying to make Black culture haram. So just take note of that. But I'll just give this follow. So thank you first for the excellent question. But let me answer it this way. So there's a very famous incident, and this is taught, again, why it's beneficial to be connected to African traditions. This story is very widely known in the Maliki teaching circles of West Africa. I've heard it many times there. I made an Instagram post about this, and it astonished people, but it's a well-known story. There's a story where Imam Malik, the eponym of the Maliki school of legal right, is absent from the city of Medina, and he leaves his principal student in charge in his absence. There is a delegation that comes from the Caucasus region, so presumably Eastern European Muslims that are new converts, and they come to get legal rulings. Imagine they've made this, you presume pilgrimage and also to visit the Holy Prophet ﷺ, and they come to get legal rulings while they're there. They don't find Malik there. They find his student. He writes legal opinions for them and they leave. Malik comes back and questions the student on what took place while he was gone. The student says, these people came from far away. I wrote opinions for them. And Malik says to him, he said, have you been to their land? And the man says, no. He said, do you speak their language? He said, no. And he said, and do you know anything of their urf and ada, of their conventions and customs? And he said, no. He said, then how could you presume to make legal rulings for them? In other words, this version of Islam that is presented as a culture that must be adopted whole, the way that it is practiced by Arabs, and replace the culture that you have, that is a modern imperialist Arab chauvinistic construct. That is not this religion. The medieval jurist Shatabi said, juristic incompetence could impose no greater burden upon a people than to cause them to give up that which is good in their conventional usages and customs. If somebody comes and tells you that you need to abandon your way of life and act like them in order to be Muslims, flee from them. Flee from them. They are imperialists, whether they are aware of it or not. And the fact that they always make this an issue with Black culture, they'll do it with Black music. Some of these people will tell you that music itself is haram, but then still listen to Kulthum. What you have it, or whatever the Arab singer's name is. I'm forgetting her name. But the point about this is, yeah. So, but let's look at this again. Very, very famous hadith about the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam with Bani Arfida, which is a tribe of Abyssinian descent, on the celebration of the day of Eid. there's many narrations that say that he applauded their musical performance, which included drumming and dancing and the singing of poetry over drumming and dancing. And that what he is quoted, and that he asks Aisha, he said, Aisha, did you not enjoy their performance? Aisha stood behind him to look over his shoulder, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so that she could watch the show. He said, Aisha, did you not enjoy the show? And he said in the narration, he said, Dunakum Bani Arfada, which means, go on, Bani Arfada. Go ahead. Do your thing. Do your thing. And then when he was questioned about this, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, he gave the explanation. He said, it's so the Jews and Christians will understand that there is latitude in religion. So listen, I understand that some people will read certain hadith in Bukhari where certain of the musical instruments that were used by the Arabs of that time are seen as being strongly discouraged. I understand that you can formulate a sound religious opinion that would say that you should steer clear of those. That's not how I read those hadith personally myself, because on those same narrations about that same Eid day, there is the playing of the flute. And it's either Umar or Abu Bakr who comes and finds the Prophet listening to a flute performance in a private home. And he says, the flute of the shaitan before the messenger of God. And the Prophet ﷺ says, every community has its Eid day. Now, this is a day of Eid, leave them alone. So the point is that a thing can be discouraged under most circumstances, but not forbidden, because it's not meant to be categorically forbidden. So even those instruments which were associated with pre-Islamic cults, and that's the reason why they're discouraged, by the way. It's not because music is meant to be categorically forbidden. It's because those were the things that were used to conjure their jinn. But in any case, the point of this is that the Prophet ﷺ, the religion that he taught, gave latitude for people to give their cultural expression in everything except for that which directly contravened God's law. We don't allow the drinking of alcohol. We don't allow the fornication. These things are beyond the bounds. But the point is that there is no blanket prohibition of your culture, that which the human being does in all of the legal schools is presumed to be permitted unless and until some direct precedent from the Quran or from the established tradition forbids it. In other words, that which the children of Adam do is presumed to be permitted unless something specifically says that it's not. And instead, many of these modern interpretations of Islam that are used specifically against Black people act as though everything that we do is haram and that we instead have to copy the way that they act.
SubhanAllah. All right, so mashallah, jazakallah khair. So we really winding down here now, and I'm afraid we may not be able to take any more questions, inshallah. Although I see my brother Muhammad.
I'll come back. Y'all ain't gotta worry about that, inshallah. I'll come back. But I want to hear from from Imam Sunni Ahmed. I see his hand at the bottom of the screen. Please unmute, Imam.
Right.
Wa alaikum salam. He's muted again. You're muted again, Imam.
All right. Is that good now?
Alhamdulillah.
All right. I want to take off from where you said about the children of Adam. This has been a point of confusion, and I know that you, in your research and in your contemplative resolve, you would have to put something into perspective in relation to this. Said Allah created Adam, some say from black mud or from sounding clay.
Yes.
And Adam was in paradise. So we have to assume in paradise there's black mud and sounding clay. An assumption. And that the origin of man, as most historians, like I said, would say, came from Africa. And originally black people from Africa.
Yep.
And from which all races come.
Indeed.
My question is basically is this. What was the reason for black people heading north to come back as white people? And what was the reason for going there from living in a nice, comfortable, warm climate to go up into the cold, to live in caves, and then to return to persecute your ancestors?
Subhanallah, God help us. So, okay, there's much that can be said on this. There's much that can be said on this. So I'll begin with this. The one slight, I would make one revision to the version of the story. You said that we think that there would be black mud in paradise. The Quran is clear that it's the tradition is clear that it is actually the clay of the earth that is molded. So the presumption, and it's clear that it's God's two hands from Surah Al-Sad, when he says to Iblis, why did you not bow to that which I made with my own two hands? And then in two separate ayahs, God says, and when I have breathed of my ruh into him, then fall down before him prostrate. So the first thing is that the frame of our ancestor Adam, and therefore our entire species, is ennobled by God's caress and touch. That's how he makes us. And it is indeed a black human form, because the name Adam itself is the only exception to the fact that the Quran never uses a single skin color or hair texture descriptor for any of its characters. That's why we don't realize that most of the people in the Quran are in point of fact black, because their skin color is not marked, because God doesn't see skin color or hair texture, he sees hearts and deeds. So he doesn't mark race, except the name Adam literally means dark brown or black in ancient Arabic. So it is a reference to that original African ancestor that is molded and from the earth and placed in the garden. So that was the one thing that I would, in my understanding, that's the distinction, and God knows best. Perhaps I can be corrected.
You know that was a trick question.
Okay. So
that was a trick question. So Leakey and the folks discovered 3.5 million years ago, black folks.
Yes.
Right? Adam was supposed to be the original ancestor. Right?
True.
So are we saying, right, that there's an
God,
evolution?
listen, so let me just say this. God never said that there were no creations before us. What God said is that we are all the children of Adam. God never said that there weren't people before the children of Adam. That's one of the mistakes that's made in the Christian Bible, because we know in point of fact that there were multiple creations that came before the children of Adam. It's just that all of us are descended from Adam and Eve.
So this comes back to the same point.
Yeah.
Age of Adam. If Adam was up and he was told to go down, is that an allegorical statement in your consideration, your opinion of that? When
no.
He was told, was that statement Adam made on earth?
The statements of repentance that they make after they fall.
Right, the statement before he came to earth, right? Was that creation was on earth or elsewhere?
The creation is in earth, but let me just be clear about this, and this is one of the most important things to understand, is that the Quran constantly is telling us that a thing can be happening simultaneously in the physical and metaphysical plane. When we ask people to choose a metaphysical explanation or a physical explanation, we are actually betraying the basic arguments of the Quran. Because if we take seriously the idea that time itself is created and that the dunya is temporary and vanishing, and that God is eternal, and that which exists outside of this created sphere is khayru wa abqa, better and more lasting, that it exists in a space outside of time, then by definition, things that take place in the metaphysical realm outside of the basic temporality of this sphere can be happening at the same time in the metaphysical space as they're happening here. So Adam's fall is both, people ask, is it metaphorical? I say it's not metaphorical, it's metaphysical.
Well, that's a beautiful answer. It's a topic I would discuss that with you privately, especially.
I would like that very much. I would like that very much.
Metaphysics and spirituality. We'll discuss that later. Yes.
Inshallah, inshallah. As for the question of why folks left Africa, listen, we still know that Europeans are the only surviving human population, with the exception of some Asian populations that have significant Neanderthal DNA in their and that's a testament to previous creation. By the way, if you read the Ethiopian Bible, which is the Injil that the Quran references, because the majority of the Christians in Western Arabia were from where? We're from Abyssinia. That Ethiopian Bible contains between 6 and 12 books that are not in the Bible that we know in the West. And one of them is the book of Enoch. The book of Enoch, or Idris, the prophet that was sent to the ancient Egyptians, the first of the prophets to teach by the pen, the beginning of that book tells the story of the way that the previous creation was exterminated before Beni Adam was brought into existence. And indeed, that is the backstory to Iblis's fall, and it is the reason for which the angels ask when Adam is made and given charge. They say, "Are you going to create something that's going to cause mischief and shed blood in the earth?" They've seen it happen already. That's why they asked.
Right. Well, that's very beautiful, because you mentioned about the Neanderthal man, and I will conclude with this. When they were saying that they came from Neanderthal man, and we realized that the furthest development of Neanderthal man is what we call in Trinidad an ebebe, a person who is dumb, ignorant. Then they decided to say, no, all right. Well, we came from all the way from Africa. We are Africans too.
Because we want to be fully human. Listen, alhamdulillah. And the truth is that from a genetic standpoint, as well as from the standpoint of just natural, reason, is that every color is already contained within the African. Everything is already in that black color. Every shade is in it. And God knows best why he made the original man in the shade that he did. But it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake.
MashaAllah. So Sheikh, we definitely we want to have a special segment on this topic, inshallah.
Let's do it. Well, I'm happy to come back. Y'all, listen, I get to talk to a lot of people, but I don't always get to talk to my people. So I can come back anytime, because this is my people. Alhamdulillah.
MashaAllah. So at this time, I will call on Sister Khairunisa Akbar to do the vote of thanks, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum and good evening, brothers and sisters.
Alaikum salam.
It is said that all good things come to an end, and indeed this is not the end, but yet another chapter in our story as we embark on our continuous quest for knowledge of self and knowledge of our deen. As we continue the legacy of struggling against oppression and enjoining what is right, we are indeed impressed and appreciative of the refreshing and eye-opening perspective on our place in history as Western Muslims and as African Muslims, and identifying our contribution in changing the course of history and correcting a huge atrocity against humanity. The members of Institute for Life, IFL, the organizers of this program would like to say Jazakallah Khair to the Sheikh, our feature speaker, Professor Dr. Rudolph Bilal Ware, for taking the time out of his busy schedule to share with us tonight. We wish to thank all participants, persons who joined the session tonight. As we know, it may be difficult in our time. It's difficult to find time at the end of a hectic week. Despite our challenges, we made the effort to join, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward us all for it. We hope to see you all next week, same time inshallah, for another session of the Who Am I series. Jazakallah khair and good night. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Walaikum salam.
Walaikum salam.
Alaikum
Salam.
I would just
Y'all take care. Stay blessed. I'll be back, inshallah.
Sheikh,
y'all in person.
Sheikh, before you go,
Yes, sir.
I want to get a quick group photo, so we would have evidence with us.
We know you have a question.
I'll stop the recording now.